if you're not familiar with the band Kiss, they were a very big hard rock band in the 1970s. And then they kind of reinvented themselves and had some hits in the 80s. And they're still around today with, in various forms. But one of the original members, Ace Frehley, has just died October 16th, which was just a couple days ago. And people die every day, and we don't lament every person that dies, but these really famous people, which Ace Frehley was, kind of a rock icon, if there ever was one, it unites more people in mourning, and I think that's why they seem more significant. Not to lessen the lives of quote unquote regular people, but we've all got lots of memories connected to songs and sometimes performances by these individuals. Ozzy passing, that's still kind of fresh in everyone's mind. And then now Ace, it's just, I guess it just shows how much we're invested in reality as it is, and how attached we are to the people that write the soundtrack for that reality. Now, Kiss doesn't, I think, get all the credit they deserve all the time, because the makeup and theatrics that they employed in the 70s and now again up to the modern day, they took their makeup off for a few years, but they often got made fun of for being overly theatrical, as if they didn't have anything to back it up. But that's definitely not true. Ace Frehley, with or without the makeup just made him look cooler. He probably looked the best out of the whole band. He was kind of the coolest guy. He was the most laid back. He was the one in interviews that you sort of felt like, of all the members of Kiss, that's the one you'd sit down and hang out with. Peter Criss as well, but Peter Criss had a little bit, has a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. But I love Kiss. I have for a long time. I saw them in '83. It was the first heavy metal concert I ever been to. My dad took me for my birthday, me and my brother. Motley Crue opened up, but unfortunately, Ace had just left the band, so it was actually Vinnie Vincent on guitar, who is kind of a strange character. I'm thinking I need to do a blog just on Vinnie Vincent. Man, that guy. Anyway, just to compare Vinnie Vincent to Ace Frehley, I mean, look, Vinnie Vincent is a total shredder, not to mention an odd fellow. That's what he looks like more recently. But the thing is, as good as Vinnie Vincent is and was, Ace Frehley just had a very unique character. And to be fair, Kiss was really big at a time where arena hard rock was still kind of like a new thing. So, we give credit to these originators, but at the same time, there's something to be said for the timing. I mean, when there aren't a lot of people doing something, when there aren't a million hard rock guitarists with their shirts off holding a Les Paul looking all badass, you kind of stand out when you're one of the first to do it, especially when you're dressed like this, the spaceman, Ace Frehley. But all that aside, whether you're talking about music or art or even skateboarding or BMXing or whatever, there's something to be said for style. It's not just about how many flips you can do or how many notes you can play, or what Ace Frehley, I think, his strong suit is his style. You can't imitate it. And he play these guitar solos, and you don't have to be a brain surgeon. You can be a punk rocker and listen to, I wanna rock and roll all night and party every day. The solo comes in and it's not crazy. It's just kind of like so rock and roll. It's very emotional. You just feel it right away. Just a few notes, boom, boom, boom. He's out. He doesn't waste your time, And there's just something very honest about the delivery with Ace Frehley. And I'm not going to say everything he did was great, because him and Kiss, they all did a lot of crap. They've got a huge repertoire. So there are very few artists who everything they create is absolutely awesome and everyone loves. There's also opinions. There's a lot of varying opinions on the different eras of Kiss. Dynasty, which is an album most Americans probably don't even know about, was apparently a huge hit in Australia. And I think Ace Frehley's song It was either New York Groove or 2000 Man, I think, one of those two songs, and a song called Shandy. These were huge hits in Australia that most Americans probably are like, what? I never heard that song. Now, how did he die? Well, this is a little murky right now, and that's cool. I mean, it just happened. People are mourning. We don't need to sit here and take apart all the details. Although I've noticed a pattern more and more lately when famous people die, there seems to be a lot more mystery and shrouding it. I mean, it's not being insensitive if you're a journalist covering a story and you're like, wow, this huge rock star died. People want to know what happened. And you go in there and you find out what happened. You interview people, whatever, police officers, forensic people, relatives. It's not entirely insensitive to just cover something, minimal detail. But, what we got from this story is that Ace, apparently he was on tour. He was preparing to put out another album. He wasn't slowing down. Like I say in some of my other videos, I don't think that a lot of these people are allowed to retire. In the case of Ace, maybe he didn't want to retire, or maybe he was still bounded by some type of contract. Anyway, all I heard was that he was in his studio and he fell down twice. And I guess he hit his head because he had internal bleeding in his brain. Next thing you know, he's on a machine and they're deciding whether to, unplug him or not. And then he passes away. It all seemed to happen so fast. Not that I necessarily pay attention to Ace these days. I mean, I read his book, No Regrets, which I think came out in 2011. But I haven't really followed Ace much. I haven't really been a big fan of his more recent output, but he still puts on a great show. I saw him maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and he just came out and just kicked ass and played all the classic Kiss tunes and all of his own classic tunes, and he still had it. Didn't lose a thing. But anyway, he was born in 1951 in Bronx, New York, and his given name was Paul Daniel Frehley. That's how he says it, Frehley. And what's funny is Paul Daniel Frehley sort of gave his name to his other band member, Stanley. That's this guy's name. His name is Stanley. His name isn't Paul. He took the name Paul and then put his first name for his last name, and so we know him as Paul. This guy is Paul Stanley, the Star Child. And it's just kind of odd, like the name Paul was too ordinary, for the guy named Paul to use, but it was just fine for Stanley to use. And I actually do a video about this, which I'll put in the description below. It was episode 3 of Off the Cuff. It was called Paul and the Eye of Horus. And I sort of link it into the whole Paul is dead conspiracy. And I won't go way into it, but it has to do with the fact that the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears, which we think was written by the guy calling himself Paul McCartney today, in that book, he alludes to the fact that his right eye is fake or was replaced. And I get into all the occult connotations of that in that video. And it's just kind of interesting that the guy who calls himself Paul, whose real name is Stanley, has a star on his right eye. But it doesn't end there. His right ear is kind of disfigured and he can't really hear out of it that well. And it is true that if you read books about Kiss, as odd as it might seem, they did sort of model themselves after the Beatles in the sense that they made a decision, and this is based on what they said. The decision to have all 4 of them sing, Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss, that decision was made because they said, well, the Beatles did it. And before the Beatles, I guess rock bands didn't typically have all 4 people singing. So that was one of the gimmicks that Kiss adapted from the Beatles. And Gene Simmons talks a lot about how much he loves the Beatles and these emotional moments he had, writing songs and on stage thinking about the Beatles. So anyway, like I said, I'll put a link to that other video in the description, or you can check out some of my videos for the RJL Reap J Lamb series. And I do mention Eric Carr, who's the drummer that replaced Peter Criss. I believe he was the sacrifice for Kiss's fame and fortune. Speaking of which, was Ace a sacrifice? I don't think so. Just because we don't have a lot of detail, you know, there may be more details that come out later about his death, although it's probably likely that there won't be, because as I said before, this seems to be a pattern. You know, look at Mark Lanegan. He wasn't exactly a spring chicken. He wasn't super old, but you know, there was plenty of reasons to not question the fact that Mark Lanegan passed away. However, if you look at Wikipedia to this day, and this was, you know, this happened a few years ago, his cause of death has still never been revealed. So we have no idea how Mark Lanegan died, and it was years ago. So I'm not saying that's going to be the case with Ace Frehley, but I don't think you can blame people for just being a little bit curious when weeks, months, and years go by. You know, and according to TMZ, and I know for a fact that TMZ lies. I talk about this in the Chris Cornell video when they put out a completely fabricated story about Chris Cornell, saying there were track marks in his arms, trying to insinuate that he shot up before he, you know, quote unquote committed suicide, which he did not shoot up. This thing about Ace Frehley falling twice, I mean, I'm trying to picture how that happens. You know, you can your imagination sort of runs wild. Was he, you know, was he just getting old and he was clumsy? Did he take some pills? Like, how do you fall twice? If you fall once and then you get up, maybe you sit down and chill out for a minute. Do you fall twice in rapid succession? I mean, what does that look like? It's kind of like enough information to get your imagination going in all kinds of directions, but not nearly enough information to really get you any specific idea. It's just, if I'm saying something that I don't know as fact, I try to make it very clear. I'm not claiming this is a fact. It's just a theory. I think that a lot of times when bands have these crazy disputes, these really dramatic money and legal disputes, I think a lot of it is explained by the fact that there needs to be a sacrifice. And maybe at some point someone says, well, hold on a minute, that's not what I signed up for. And then some creepy guy, maybe in a suit, comes up and goes, you sure did, look at this. You know, and I use this to explain away what happened in Queensryche in my video, The Queen's Reich, which I guess I'll link that too in the description. Basically, there needs to be a sacrifice, and someone's like, well, I don't want to go, you got to go. And I think that perhaps Jeff Tate was supposed to be the sacrifice, and that's why he flipped out in Queensryche, and that's why their whole career kind of just went straight into the toilet after being almost like a mainstream pop band for a minute there. I think that's probably has something to do with why Chris DeGarmo left and why we never got an explanation. So anyway, to get back to Kiss, you know, Ace leaving the band, we all know about the drama between Ace and the rest of the band, and mainly the faction, you know, of Peter Criss and Ace Frehley versus, you know, the Jews in the band, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, on the other side, sort of holding the contracts and holding the money and being the sort of Illuminati connection or whatever, you know. And I'm not trying to put Gene and Paul down for being Jews. I'm talking about the stereotypes that they sort of conveniently fit into. And Gene himself is proud to talk about how much he loves money and all that. He's probably the number one guy to stereotype himself. But anyway, I'm not denying that there's a lot of drama in these bands, but I think that one other aspect of that that's possible is that, you know, Ace Frehley leaving the band and Peter Criss, maybe this was like them saying, oh, wait a minute, okay, I don't want all that I don't want to pay the price that stardom is going to cost, you know. And that happened in the form of Eric Carr. Eric Carr comes in, and it's kind of like in Star Trek, when they go down on a planet and they don't know what they're going to find. And, you know, Kirk, Spock, and Bones and Ensign Nobody will all go down to the planet. And there's this joke that, okay, so Ensign Nobody, you know, he's going to die because the main characters can't die. So someone's got to get sacrificed. So I'm not saying Eric Carr is a nobody. He was a fantastic drummer. He's a big part of why Kiss was still relevant in the 80s, because he gave them that powerful 80s punch that the band really needed to stay modern. Not to put Peter Criss down, because I love the 70s era of Kiss the most, but 80s Kiss was a force to be reckoned with, and Eric Carr was a big part of that. And then he ends up dead. Of course, it wasn't going to be one of the main characters, right? And I think that this might be the reason Uli Roth left the Scorpions right before they got super duper huge. I mean, they were already big in the 70s. But Uli Roth leaves the band. Oh, I don't want to be so commercial. I want to be more whatever. But I don't know if I buy that, because, they were already playing, poppy music. Although, to be fair, Uli Roth was probably the most psychedelic element in that band. You could say perhaps most artistic. But overall, the band was all about love and sex and having fun. And their album covers were always really intentionally explicit, intentionally offensive, you might say. I've got a copy of this album here, Virgin Killer, and this is not the whole cover. The whole cover has this girl, she's naked on the cover of the album, and she's obviously underage. They got a lot of crap for that, but this is the kind of stuff, these are the kind of album covers the Scorpions had in the 70s. And it just seems kind of funny that after all that, Uli Roth's like, no, it's cool, I'm checking out. And I think that might have to do with the fact that a sacrifice needs to be made. And that eventually occurred in the form of their drummer. I can't remember his name. He was an American guy. Anyway, I digress. So, I love Ace's music. He seemed like a wonderful guy. Like I said earlier, he's kind of like the most low-key member of the band. He seemed very personable. We don't know these people, but you can get a feel for their character. And Ace was just a very likable guy and extremely talented. I believe he drew the band's logo, the Kiss logo. I believe he came up with it. He's very artistically inclined. The last thing I'll say is what kind of sticks out in my mind from his book, No Regrets. He said that, I think he said he was really upset one time, or he was kind of losing his mind. So he went into Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, and he drove his Ferrari, whatever, his car, around the block over and over. And he said he would do this sometimes when he couldn't take it, couldn't take reality. And he said he was testing fate. He'd go around the block and drive as fast as he could. And he figured if he hit something and died, then that was just fate. But if nothing happened, then it wasn't fate for him to die. I thought that was kind of an interesting statement that he made. That sounds very crazy to me. I would never do that. But maybe we all sort of do that in our own way at various points in time. Throw caution to the wind. Anyways, rest in peace, Spaceman. We'll definitely miss you.